Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We are on day 5 of Connect KARO, and we are starting off with the second session of electrification of public bus-based public transport. I thank all our esteemed speakers who have joined us today, despite their busy schedules and despite the timelines. And I also thank all the participants who have joined us today on the platform of CK. So without much ado, I would like to invite Dr. O.P. Agarwal to deliver the opening remarks for this session. Over to you, OP, sir.
Thanks, Aparna. It's a delight to see so many friends on this, so many big names on this, people who are leading this work on electric mobility in India. All of you are part of that entire brigade that is leading this work. It's a delight to see all of you. And with a group like this, I don't think I should be taking up too much time with opening remarks. But let me say this, that from WRI's side, Connect KARO is our mainstream, our flagship event every year. This is our 10th year. So we're really celebrating our 10th year, and we look upon all of you as our very esteemed partners. And it's really the kind of partnership we've had with you that has helped us progress our work, our mission further and further. So it's a really thanks to all of you for supporting us in all these years. As far as this particular session is concerned, everyone here knows about the importance of electric vehicles in the Indian policy space and why we need electric vehicles in India. Mr. Sinha is leading this charge from the Niti Aayog, and frankly, his leadership has brought a lot of dynamism into this space over the last couple of years that he has been here. Electric buses are critical to this transformation. But the big challenge is, how do you deal with an issue where you have higher capital costs, even though you have lower operating costs? Most state bus operating companies have a challenge of resources in being able to pay for even regular buses. What happens when the costs are much higher with electric buses? So that's why the session is really focusing much more on what are innovative ways in which we can finance these services. So that is really what we are hoping to hear in this. With all of you there, I really don't need to say much more, but I eagerly look forward to the discussions. And with that, let me pass it back to Aparna. Aparna, over to you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for those encouraging words on finding innovative means of financing electric buses. So that's where we come in here. Today we are presenting to you a focus group discussion where we are discussing how we can streamline the procurement process for electric bus adoption at scale, where we will be focusing on alternate funding methods, innovative financing instruments, and business models for electric bus adoption. So with that, this session is actually a follow-up on a session that we had around 2-3 weeks back, where we had a similar gathering, and the discussion was on how do we reimagine public transport in India through electric buses, and there were very key takeaways from that session, and that is what we hope to follow up on this discussion, and more on that Madhav will be speaking. With that, I would invite Shri Sudhendu Jyoti Sinha, Advisor, Infrastructure, Connectivity and Electric Mobility at Niti Aayog, to deliver the keynote address. Sinha Sab, over to you.
Thank you, Aparna. Thank you, Dr. Agarwal and his WRI team, for always making me a part of their number of events. And it is always, I go back with a lot of takeaways. And I must appreciate the kind of work that you are doing in the entire this transformation of mobility paradigm from ICE to electric. So you rightly said that the traction is available, the optics is there, the policy support is available, and now people are almost with us, kind of they also want to go with this change, with this disruption. And as it was rightly told, that this particular mobility is going to give to this country one of the greatest employment opportunity that could ever be seen. So that is another viewpoint. So in 2008, Prime Minister inaugurates Global Move Summit. 2019, March, National Mission on Transformative Mobility was set up at Niti Aayog. 2019, April, the second version of FAME was introduced. Now, the same FAME scheme was re-strategized in the month of June. In the same month, June of this year, PLI scheme of advanced chemistry cell comes. So now the vehicles have been incentivized. After that, battery has been incentivized. And finally, the day before yesterday, Cabinet approves the auto component for electric vehicles. So now the components have been incentivized. Practically, the entire loop closes. So now what we are left with is probably how to proliferate this charging infrastructure and how precisely to increase the proliferation of electric vehicles in 9 cities. And definitely buses have to play a big role. Now, let me tell you, today also there was a very critical, very important high-level meeting where best of the people were there, all those decision makers in the first half. And there also it was, they emphasized, they were just concentrating on these 9 cities and how to take it forward. And they were definitely talking of the buses because of their size, because of their number, because of the purpose for which they are there, that is the shared mobility. Now, the most interesting thing is that once we were re-strategizing the bus component, the bus segment in the FAME 2, we were a little worried that we didn't know how will the states, how will the SRTUs behave, how will they respond to our offer of aggregating, driving it through CESL, how will they react to it? So that was always a kind of constant doubt in our minds. But the best part that we see is that the kind of demand that they have pegged in for the buses to ply the buses in their states, in these 9 cities, that is phenomenal. Almost close to 10,000 is the number that is put together, all these 9 cities. That is what the demand is. Now, 9 cities, 10,000 buses, this is amazing. I don't know, some of them may back out because of so many factors, but assuming that even if, say, 4,000, 5,000 we are able to achieve, so with this kind of 500 buses per city, that is a phenomenal achievement, and that will be giving a lot of visibility to the mobility paradigm. But yes, all these states, all the stakeholders, financial institutions, the OEMs, the SRTUs, the state, ESL, all of them, they require that the kind of financial arrangement that we work out with them, that is absolutely a win-win situation for each one of them. It should not be that one is losing, another one is winning kind of thing. Then only this thing can be taken forward. And as Dr. Agarwal initially said, that this has got a contrasting proposition with regard to the operating cost and with regard to the capital cost. How to come out with that fine balance so that it becomes acceptable to all, that is what the challenge is. And I'm sure this particular seminar, this particular get-together webinar, this is going to come at a conclusive position and come out with certain models so that at least among all these 9 states, 9 SRTUs, it becomes acceptable to them. One of the 2 or 3 options, one of them should be definitely acceptable to them, and that would be the real kind of purpose, and that will be the impact of this particular webinar. So thanks a lot. Thank you, Dr. Agarwal, for calling me. Thank you, Aparna, for coordinating it forward. And Pawan, yes, you have always been there. Thank you. Over.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for actually precisely laying out what laying out the framework for this conversation is as to how do we essentially reap the benefits of aggregating around 10,000 buses for 9 cities while paving way for much more scale up across the country. With that, I would like to take 5 minutes of your time to, with the presentation, to set the context for this discussion. So I'll be sharing my screen now. I hope you can see my screen.
Yes, please go ahead.
Thanks. Streamlining the procurement process for electric bus adoption at scale. So this is the focus group discussion that we are laying out for you. And this focus group discussion is a discussion as part of the transformative urban mobility initiative electric bus mission that is right now underway in India, where we have 5 deep dive cities which we will be working with across multiple partners, and WRI and GIZ are the co-leads for this mission across the world, and we will be focusing at these 5 cities, of which all of them are part of the grand challenge that is being floated by CESL. We have, we are grateful to our donors of the TUMI electric bus mission for giving us an opportunity to gather all these eminent speakers for this session. Let us deep dive into the discussion right now. So with this, I would like to just present before you the public buses, a few numbers for public buses in India. So right now we have around 1.4 lakh public buses in India, while around 22% of this existing fleet is overage. And the average age kind of ranges between 3 to 10 years. And in India, we look at the life of a bus at 12 years. So on the right, you can see that we have, based on the discussions and the takeaways during the roundtable around 2-3 weeks back, we pulled together some numbers from the key cities in India. So apart from a very few cities, you can see that most of our cities have, have quite a, around more than 8 years average age of fleet. So this is the kind of demand that that we are foreseeing for electric buses in India. And we had a discussion earlier today in the morning as to what do we, how are we incorporating electric buses into the current fleet. So this is food for thought when we are discussing about how do we operate electric buses, and also what is the replacement ratio, and how do we replace such a huge number of the demand for buses that is coming up in future. And some of the measures that we have made is the aggregation of demand, rightly mentioned by Sinha sir, where we are aggregating the demand of electric buses under the FAME subsidy for 9 cities. And we also have the PLIs worth of around 81,000 crores and 57,000 crores for R&D, localization and export of electric vehicle batteries, and recently for automobiles and auto components. So this is the current status of electric bus deployment in India. And what we see right now is that uh, over around 7,000 buses have been sanctioned under FAME, and around 1,000 buses of those are deployed on ground. And this is a statistic since 2015. So we hope to achieve around 10,000 buses by 2023. And how are we positioned to actually scale it up to that level? So here we are looking at the various business models. So there is the leased business model, where more or less all the components, the components including land, can be leased by a separate service provider. And whereas in shared ownership, we are looking at shared ownership of depots, terminals, chargers, while for full ownership, what we call the outright purchase model, it is all assets. And when we are looking at the risks of entering into such a business model, we have categorized it into operation, technology, monetary, and returns risk. So while looking at the operations risk, what we discussed earlier today, essentially they are the risk of charging and maintenance of buses, the batteries, while there are also the intensive duty cycles that are the conventional buses are running on now, which needs some variations while incorporating electric buses, which we discussed earlier today. And there are also the legacy challenges for STUs. Like there is a huge STUs run on a huge manpower, and these are some and also there is a skill gap when a new technology like electric buses is being incorporated. So these are some of the legacy challenges that we foresee. And again, on technology, this has been discussed quite a lot in multiple discussions regarding range limitation, the battery longevity, the charger technology, the charging time, which is also related to operations, and the obsolescence of all of these. All of these with change in technology, right? And while looking at the monetary or the risks on the transactions, what we are seeing is that yes, electric buses, because of the high prohibitive capital cost, and also due to the limited avenue for revenue realization, those poses a huge risk on availing cheap financing for electric buses. And again, as discussed, the returns are limited. So we need to have cognizance of the facts that we right now we are only looking at a majority of the returns is fare box revenue, while we need to also tap into the non-fare box revenue if we are looking at returns through operations only. So what are some of the risk mitigation mechanisms that has come in? So here the innovation where we are looking at the aggregation of demand for buses, that itself is is a key innovation that we have incorporated, while crowdsourcing buses and charging infrastructure can be thought of. And we just tried to draw out some of the some global examples. We have been discussing this with Niti Aayog as well. So how the unbundling model in Santiago, Chile has actually diffused risks across stakeholders. So we have been discussing the Chile model, where I mean, where the operations and maintenance are with separate providers, and this essentially is a risk mitigation mechanism. And there is also the inclusion of credit-worthy partners in the form of central guarantees, which is improving the bankability. So these are some of the means that we can also bring in, and this conversation will essentially look at how do we draw parallels from Chile or from other global examples to not only on the electric buses front, but also on other sectors, on other renewable energy sectors, clean technology sectors, which can be utilized for the electric buses. So I mean, just to summarize what I want to discuss over here. So, I mean, on risk mitigation and improving procurements, I mean, essentially, we need to look at improving bankability, improving credit worthiness through guarantees, and also to identify and I mean, delineate the scope of responsibilities between the various players, while also making sure that we are factoring in inflation, and there is also there is the discipline while the contractual liabilities are in place. So with that, we also looked at what are some of the sources of funds. So while looking at funding and financing, we are looking I mean, yes, the definition would be looking at I mean, funding essentially as subsidies. But here in this discussion, let us focus more on what are some of the sources of funds that can be tapped into for electric buses. Can we only look at subsidies and the revenues from the STUs or city bus operations, or can we also look at cross subsidization, looking at the various I mean, various cess taxes, or even monetizing real estate? So these are some of the sources of funds, and we have also been having discussions on the various financing instruments like green bonds, the concessional loans which are provided by various development banks, and how can we tap into the international markets, the private investors? How do we ensure accessibility of these funds to I mean, how do we ensure accessibilities of these funds to the various I mean, various levels of agencies, right? Like, do we ensure the accessibility to the central agencies, so that there is that central guarantee, and then does it come down to the state and the STUs or the city bus agencies? Or we have also seen many examples, even in India, where the agencies or the states themselves have been looking at funds from the various instruments that are being discussed right now. So what is the way ahead, and how can we leverage these various funding options? How can we leverage public funds? How can we pool? How do we pool funds from various heads? Is that a pragmatic approach? And how is risks how are the risk allocation ensured? And what are some of the risk mitigation strategies that can reduce the pressure on financing agencies? So these are some of the questions that we hope to answer during this conversation. With that, I'm handing it over to Madhav. So over to you, Madhav.
Thank you very much, Aparna, for that presentation and for setting the context for this conversation. I just want to say several of you, Ashish ji, Randir, Nishant, all of you were part of a conversation that was more focused on the second question, which was pooling and channeling, aggregation that we did a couple of weeks ago towards the end of August. And a lot of you had also said that, you invite to these sessions and what do you do with it. And so what we've been, I think 2, 3 things came out very clearly in that conversation. One was this whole pipeline of buses that are, so what we've done is Aparna briefly showed the average age of the vehicles across these top 10 STUs, but we have deeper information, right? So we can now start looking at contracts, where, if they are PPPs, when do the GCC contracts end, what beyond just the life of the bus. So that information is available that we could almost construct into a pipeline. Like for example, Delhi has all buses now almost average age is 12 years. So, so what I'm trying to say is that, that pipeline at the national level, we can start to put together so that's one thing. The second is this time we thought we will make a bigger attempt to invite a lot of more the financing experts in the conversation, so just, I think just bringing these two aspects to see, if we can move the conversation forward as we go along. So with that, let's start this conversation. I'll start with Ashish ji. Ashish ji, DTC in January cleared 1,000 buses and its maintenance for another 300 AC buses. And you were talking the EV policy proposes pooling of diesel cess at 25 paise per liter and getting that money into the EV fund as a fee bait. Are there other sources that you are thinking about as well, or for the moment this plus fare box, and you think you will be able to manage sort of this transition, this ambitious transition that you've planned out?
So first of all, this 1,000 buses was actually CNG. They were not electric. 300 buses, the order which was placed was for electric. But just to set the context, in electric vehicle policy, we have set a target that by 2025, half of our fleet will be electric. The numbers which you put out of the Delhi fleet are slightly misleading because they just capture the DTC fleet. You have to, when you look at Delhi, it is the overall fleet size which you have to look at, which is about 6,500 buses. Nearly half of them are run on a concession model and half of them are owned and operated by DTC. So Delhi, it's agnostic to what model we are following. So the age of the buses which are on concession model is well within limits. So it's not as if it is a completely overaged kind of a fleet. But having said that, we have prepared a roadmap of reaching the goal of 50% by 2025, and I think we'll be putting it out soon enough over the next month or so for public information, which means that year on year, what is the incremental change to electric that we are planning, so that it's a signaling the extent of in Delhi.
I think we're having some difficulty with it. Let's just wait for a minute or so. Otherwise,
bus space, it's a very strong dependency on the Can you hear me?
Ashish ji, we were struggling with your connection a little bit. So last couple of minutes we didn't hear you. So maybe you can repeat, or maybe we'll come back to you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, now we can hear you fine. Yeah, please. Yeah. No. Okay. I think we'll just we'll wait for him.
Okay. Is it better now? Maybe I switched on.
No, it's still not better. It's coming in and out. Maybe we'll come to you in a couple of minutes, and just hopefully your connection might have improved by then. Randir, I'll come to you while we wait for Ashish ji. DHI now FAME subsidy is in its third stage, but at the same time, Mahua has now launched this, is very close to launching this big scheme to augment public transport. So, just wanted to think about how Niti Aayog is looking at the big picture for sort of public buses in India, and do you think subsidies are here to stay? Do we need to provide them sort of what is the long-term view? So if you can just sort of share some thoughts on that, that would be great.
Thank you, Madhav. Thank you for inviting me here. I hope I am audible. Can you
Yes,
hear me?
yes, absolutely.
Perfect. Yeah. So first of all, thank you for inviting me here. It's a very pertinent question that how we look at the big picture. I think Sir has already laid down, the groundwork, how Niti Aayog perceive and in fact the government of India perceive for the public transport, and also the subsidies, whether they are going to stay or not. See, in the long term, of course, pushing everything with the subsidy is not a feasible solution. So in a long term, of course, regulatory and statutory, the push has to kick in. The private sector has also to take part in this. But for initial throttle, for initial buzz, this is something which government of India or the governments across the world are doing. This is an upcoming technology and it's a very new technology, still unproven. In fact, that is why people are, this your seminar also says the innovative funding options. So why we are talking about innovative funding options in automotive sector, which is existing for hundreds of years? Because this is a very, very new sector. We cannot correlate it directly with the existing ICE engine sector, which is fully developed. And in fact, in India, we are one of the largest automotive producer as well as the parts producer. So in this particular sector also, initial throttle is needed for sure in terms of all the, from the EV infrastructure side, from the vehicle side, from the financing part, from the battery side, from the cell manufacturing side. So in fact, R&D side also. So from all sides, entire value chain needs the push. So that initial push would be done through the government, which has already been done. Close to $8 billion has already been done in 3 different schemes. FAME 2 is there, ACC program is there, recently launched automotive PLI is there. And I think this is enough subsidy and enough facilitation has been done. In addition to these fiscal incentives, there are n number of non-fiscal incentives which has been done by different ministries, from the standard side, from the discom side, from the power tariff, which is regulated, plus 15% of average cost of supply. So from, fiscal, non-fiscal, both sides, lot of things has already been, registration has been waived off. In addition to what central government is doing, in fact, the state governments are taking one step, they are taking this one step ahead. So they are not only subsidizing, incentivizing, and promoting the things which are there in the central government policies, but of course they are adding their own USPs also, what they can push from their side. So, but of course, for the limited period of time. And, as the battery prices are going down, as the technology is getting improved, it is reaching to their flat curve. So we will see that the way IC engines have been picked up in the similar way, this will be done in the case of the EV also. In fact, when Sir was discussing with me one thing, and he pointed out one very good thing, that India is actually, the fastest in terms of when actually we started doing, promoting these EV vehicles. So in the last 2 to 3 years, that is when the maximum focus is being done. And we have done relatively well compared to the other countries which are doing and subsidizing these vehicles for so long. So we are not lagging behind, first of all. So we are catching up, and the policies in last 2 to 3 months, so many things has been already been announced. And if we just see, I forget that last 2 years of the COVID, then definitely in last 2 months, whatever pickup has been done in the EV segment, whatever changes has been done, those changes will definitely transform the EV industry. And talking about the buses segment, so the FAME 1 scheme, which was launched in 2015, it sanctioned total of 390 e-buses for the 11 cities. At the end of the FAME 1 in April 2019, Government of India announced the second phase of the scheme. Subsequently, FAME 2 scheme being rolled out with an outlay of 10,000 crores, which was initially spread for the 3 years. 35% of the total FAME 2 scheme, it is allocated to the bus procurement in cities. In fact, DHI earlier selected 64 cities across India to receive financial incentive for the deployment of 6,000 plus buses. In fact, in addition to the FAME scheme, urban bus providers in Ahmedabad, Pune, Bangalore, and STUs like Himachal Road Transport Corporation, they are also procuring e-buses through independent efforts. So more than 600 e-buses are currently operational across India through the FAME scheme and other independent efforts. In fact, in latest amendment notified by DHI, ESL will be aggregating e-buses for 9 cities, 4 million plus under FAME2 scheme on OPEX basis. So this is the idea is, sir has already pointed out, to flood these 4 million plus 9 cities with the buses with the focus structure. And of course, later on, once these things are proven, the intent is being known, the infrastructure is being created, this will proliferate to other places also. So I would touch upon 2 points, which is the topic of this discussion also, the funding wise. So in addition to the aggregation model on which the CESL is working, state EV policies also have incentives built in to promote EVs and charging infra. This is over and above what center provides. In parallel, we also need to see that EV manufacturing and charging infra that should be included in the PSL and given an infrastructure status by including in maybe the harmonized list of infrastructure subsectors. So we also need to work in this direction. And private players and OEMs also need to work with FIs to convince them of product quality and performance. This would generate and enhance the investor confidence. And this is very, very important. In fact, international lending institutions such as World Bank, they also need to work with the local institutions, local banks to facilitate cheaper loans in this sector. In fact, talking about the business models, yes, innovative business models one thing, but to point out what type of it could be, maybe the pay-per-use, long-term leasing by the companies for their employees, OEMs leasing the buses to the operators, the pilot runs, government mandating to government-run organization, and also a step further by private schools, companies. This will further boost the adoption. And lastly, with improved total cost of ownership and the reduced battery prices, the adoption of electric buses should pick up. But currently, not enough models are available in this country. So what OEMs also need to do is they should come out with affordable and the different size models. They shouldn't only stick to the 9 meter or the 12 meter. The 7 meter and 6 meter, those buses are also very much important for the end mile connectivity in different segments. And the sufficient range, not very high range, but the range should be sufficient to serve this market. That's it from my side.
Thank you, Mr. Ranveer Singh, Director Electric Mobility at Niti Aayog. So that's who you were hearing. Now I'll go back to Shri Ashish Kundra, IAS Principal Secretary, Transport, Government of Delhi. So you were actually talking.
Yeah, sorry. So anyway, what I was trying to say was that in Delhi, we have prepared a plan for transition to electric, which will ensure that 50% of our buses are electric by 2025. And we'll be putting this out in public domain very soon. And that in a way is a signaling for OEMs to kind of give them an order of magnitude and the pace of transition to electric. And I think if each city kind of does this year-on-year projection, it will help in ramping up of production capabilities of OEMs. That is number one. Second is that, from our standpoint, one of the risks which is clear is the operating risk. So right now, the entire, for example, in the CNG space, in Delhi, we have a very clear model in which we kind of have operators who buy buses from manufacturers and then run them. And, they kind of bid out on a per kilometer kind of a rate at which we pay them. And so half of our fleet is running on that model. Now, the problem is that in electric, or the challenge is, let's say that there are not too many operators who are willing to take that risk in venturing into this space because of technology risk, obsolescence risk, range issues, and so on and so forth. So I think somewhere the OEMs will have to forge partnerships, because to expect that OEMs will take upon themselves operating responsibilities across the country is also a difficult proposition. So if there can be perhaps I don't know, some kind of a risk mitigation fund, which is operating risk mitigation, because there is a shelf life of the battery, number one, which in any case will be replaced midway during the contract. But it's possible that by the time you are replacing it, new batteries are coming, so there might be some retrofitting required potentially, which also needs to be catered to. And the other thing which I want to mention is that the pace of electrification for each city, especially the large cities, is a function also of the pace at which we are able to electrify our depots. And that is a function of the availability of power in the grid. So like in Delhi, anywhere between less than 4 megawatts, which supports 100 buses, you can kind of do it quickly within a period of 3 to 6 months. But anywhere which is anything which is beyond 4 megawatt load will take anywhere between 18 to 24 months. So unless the supporting infrastructure is ready, that's number one. Then there is the issue of opportunity charging infrastructure, which needs to be kind of installed at various locations in city, if at all. I mean, or it is left to the operators to install opportunity charging facilities across the city. That needs to be looked at. So net, I think at this juncture, FAME2 does provide a framework, and this aggregation thing, I think, is a good model. Except that in a previous conversation, I had mentioned that in Delhi, we have a peculiarity because we have low floor buses. And I don't know how much of price advantage will come out of an aggregation model, because not every city has the mandate to have necessarily low floor buses. And in terms of the financing, which was mentioned, I think right now, advertising and fare box collection is the only other way. But I think one thing which we need to kind of also bring into this conversation is, are we trying to say that ridership on an electric bus is to be treated the same as on any other bus? Or are cities willing to charge for people for sustainable mobility? Although the operating costs are lower, it's a bit of a paradox because the operating costs are actually lower. So in a way, technically, charging higher for that is also a bit of a challenge. But nonetheless, in terms of positioning yes, it is a matter of pride that I am riding on a vehicle which is a sustainable mobility, achieving that goal. So I don't know internationally how it is done, whether there's a differential pricing of electric versus the traditional buses, or it is the same price structure which is followed all over. So I think I would like to listen to everybody else and maybe at some later stage.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I think you've raised quite a few questions, I think, which is excellent. I mean, one on risk mitigation, battery shelf life, who provides and where, opportunity charging, the whole depot electrification sort of challenges, and the 4 megawatt threshold, and this final sort of issue of differential parking that you raised. I'm going to call on Swati and Gerald at a later point of time. They are also actively engaged in Tamil Nadu and Maharashtra in some of these conversations. So I don't know, I would be good to hear if you have sort of dealt with some of these similar questions, but I'll come to you later. Right now, I'm going to call on Mr. Vivek Sen. He's the manager at Climate Policy Initiative. He's worked on aggregation and securitization facility at the Bureau of Energy Efficiency, especially around the aggregation of demand for LED bulbs. He securitized that asset, and then also has been instrumental in developing the sustainable energy bond for RE. So I think with some of these experiences, what learnings from this work you think could be brought to this idea of, electric bus financing, procurement, aggregation? So just looking to hear from you.
Thank you so much, and it's a pleasure to be part of this panel. First of all, I would want to start off with something Mr. Agarwal quoted when he was giving his opening remarks. It's the problem of delta. So when you look at the ICE engine versus, or ICE vehicle versus a EV, the cost of an EV is almost, say, 40% or 30% or even higher than the ICE vehicle, right? So you have a higher proportion of finance that is needed or cost that has to be borne. But when you look at the ridership side, you can expect, even if there is a differential pricing, you can expect the tariffs that would be charged to the consumers. I mean, those would be not more than 2 or 5% or at the max 10% more than a typical ICE vehicle tariffs. Now that creates a differential. So there is a delta that is to be managed. Now, what this delta does is it creates a package of risks. It creates a package of risk for all stakeholders that are involved. If you look at from the public transport or public transportation side and the way the financing and the leasing happens, I mean, you need to eliminate that risk for the owners of those public transport systems. Now, that means you need to create an intervention that will absorb or rather eliminate that risk. So one of the ways that immediately come to my mind is that why don't we have a dedicated financing institution that is coming up with innovations on the financing side, like supporting the regular financing. And since this is the adoption stage, why don't we have credit guarantees or credit enhancement mechanisms that will support an early adoption of technology which is still in the process of being proven or being proliferated. Secondly, we also have to look at from the risk angle of who is setting up the charging infrastructure, because they come as an important component of the overall, I should say, scheme of things. Now, as per the laws are mandated, it is either the DISCOM in every state or the Road Transport Corporation of every state or the Highway Authority, which has been mandated to create charging infrastructure for EVs and especially for public transport systems. Now, for them, this is a business that they have never seen before, right? So it's a risk that is coming onto their business model. Now, to absorb that risk and assume it on their books, they need innovation on their business modeling side. Now, to support that thing, something like a project preparation facility needs to be given to them, something which will help them train for a large scale adoption of EVs on their books. And this facility essentially has to be targeted towards government stakeholders, because not just will it provide the financing support, but it will also provide you the necessary know-how and guidance of running the EV bus business, which is used as a public good. Then thirdly, the another piece which has emerged very strongly is the manufacturing side of this whole value chain, and especially the battery manufacturers, which have been I should say bowed by the mission which states that we can have 55 gigawatt of advanced battery manufacturing units. So we need to create gigafactories. Now, gigafactories cannot be created if there is no appropriate or dedicated concessional lines of finance. So here we need to look at concessional lines of finance, which may essentially come from multilateral and bilateral development banks, international financing institutions, government support subsidies, fiscal and financial incentives that can come to them. Here, what we are trying to address is the institutional risk that would be faced by those who are trying to invest into creating these gigafactories. Now, I straight away jumped into that band of what are the mitigation measures. But one thing I would want to mention is that all this is being done to manage that delta, right? Essentially. So one thing is very clear to all of us, and I think this has been debated for very long that the traditional ways of financing won't work, and we need to innovate. There is one aspect, I think, which has been not discussed up till now, but can play an important role. It is not a direct, I should say, central risk mitigation measure, but from road transportation sector, carbon pricing can also play an important role. What it can do is it can address the imperfections of other policies. Say, for example, rebound effect in vehicle efficiency standards, or decarbonizing the supporting sectors like the electricity sector, right? So here what it can do is it can create that incentive for these allied sectors to become so robust that they are able to provide the services to the public transport sector at a much lower cost. And this will again help in reducing that delta. Eventually, over a period of time, when you have to commercialize a technology, you need to ascertain and make sure that you actually do not have a delta in place. Rather, it's a give and take, pure market play that is taking everything into account and acting as a pure market, right? Last thing what I would want to touch upon is that is essentially from the way this market has started. As of now, we have seen a lot of regulations, a lot of policies that are supporting uh, electrification of transportation in India, and especially public transportation. I would say the role of market makers cannot be something which cannot be overlooked. And here comes entities like CESL, Convergence Energy Services Limited. When when the LED story started in India, it was EESL that played that role of a market maker, that aggregated the demand, that centralized the risk, and acted as a central counterparty for all the LED demand in India, right? Essentially, the same role can be performed by an entity like CESL. CESL needs to think big, it needs to grow, and it needs to expand its horizon. When it will expand its horizon, it will have to take into account the innovations that are needed to kind of uh, uh, further this whole play of demand and supply. So with that, I'll stop, and I'm also looking forward to some great discussion here. There are a great set of experts. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Mr. Vivek. I think very important. I mean, I think even in fact, 2 days ago, we had a separate conversation on project preparation facilities in the context of climate smart cities. And, so I think, the idea of project preparation facilities, is something also that needs sort of further conversations across India. And I think very relevant for this context as well. Now, I'd like to call upon Shri Ram Mahidhara. He is the former chief investment officer from the International Finance Corporation. He now works as an independent expert on infrastructure, especially in emerging markets. Ram, you've heard the conversation so far, and I think just broadly, I think both on the questions of financing, risk mitigation, the financing the delta, risk mitigation. I mean, just broad thoughts from your side, and not just focused on sort of really both, also looking at from the perspective of the private sector, because that's also a lot where you're expert. Vivek spoke about gigafactories. We're talking about a lot of the manufacturers now ramping up this capacity. So and then the concessional loans and things like that they will get. So a little bit, can you touch on that? And also then I think sort of any thoughts on the risk mitigation ideas on the side of the public sector? Yeah.
Thank you, Madhav. Boy, every time I attend a conversation on India or in India, I just leave completely, what should I say, completely stunned by the amount of talent, the thought process, and the contribution that there are on these topics. So I think people have already discussed virtually everything that there is to be. Let me touch upon a couple of things that I heard that we might want to look at. There was focus on capital costs, and these are not in any very well structured order, so these will be more random thoughts. There was a conversation about total capital costs, these being high. How do we kind of address this? There was a conversation by several folks, and Ashish Kundra ji mentioned about lower operating costs and can we charge more for something like that. I think rather than take those two separately, it probably is a good idea, as always, to look at the total cost of operations, which is really a sum of the two over the life of the project. That's generally what private sector operators do when they take not just the capital, but also the operating costs, add them together and say, over the life of the project, what is the total cost? What is the total return? How do I make money? Right? So that's one thing. I think that's important. In the case of EVs, several people have posited that there is an additional cost you've got to look at. And I've looked at some structures, and I like the one that EDF has put out. I find it particularly comprehensive. And they add to total cost of operation the notion of total cost of electrification. Because this is a peculiar characteristic of this, this type of transport. And in the total cost of electrification, they talk about several things: hard costs, soft costs, risks, friction, etc. I think that's really a well-structured way to look at it. And it's something we can discuss either offline or later, but it's something worth looking at. Within the hard costs, they talk about financing. Within the soft costs, there are several things, whether you have guarantees or subsidies, etc. There are also frictions in terms of how do you adapt and adopt these technologies, right? So that's kind of one point. Vivek mentioned carbon pricing. That's an entirely different issue, but I think it's really important. When we are talking about paying for these technologies, we're talking about commercial, non-commercial, i.e. subsidies. I think carbon pricing is a way to try and see if we can actually even out this the playing field between combustion engine buses and non-combustion engines. So those are some of the issues. There was also a mention of can we look at multilateral banks for concessional financing? And there are kind of two types of multilateral banks. One is the ones that provide long-term, low-cost loans, ones that work with governments where central governments are the shareholders and central governments are the customers, are the clients. That is, the World Bank, the African Development Bank, certainly what they call the sovereign part of operations. That's one part. There's a second part, which is the private sector operations, which is the IFC, the IDB Invest, the private sector parts of the EBRD, etc. Those ones are the ones that I know the best. They are the ones I would say who look at projects purely on a commercial basis. They lend to the private sector. They sometimes invest, i.e. put equity in private sector projects. But when they're looking at that, they're looking at it from a commercial viewpoint. And as a commercial viewpoint, it's quite simple. Is the entire structure operated on a commercially viable basis? Is the operator able to make the relevant return? Are all the risks considered? If we were financing when I was IFC, and I'm sure it's the same case in every other organization, we had to consider all the risks. What are the technical risks? We had engineers on staff, we had lawyers on staff, and we would look at regulatory risks, at technical risks, at financing risks, obviously, but a whole bunch of other things. I made some notes because it's so early in the morning. I was sure I was going to forget something or the other. So let me see if I can find my notes. But there are also other risks that private sector operators have to look at. Expropriation risk, political risks, environmental and social risks. These are also issues that you've got to consider in any private sector project, and electric mobility is not any different. Coming back to electric mobility, we've talked about India putting out 10,000 buses. That is a much larger volume than what's happening. I think Europe has something like 4,000 buses right now. 98% of the buses, electric vehicles in the world, sit in China. And just as China did with the solar industry, where they subsidized the hell out of it, so they did with electric buses, right? And look at where solar energy and solar panels are today, right? You've got a 90% reduction in cost, but that's taken about 8 to 10 years. So the massive scale, it's a chicken and egg problem. The massiveness of scale is important because that is where you get economies of scale, you get standard cutting down of costs, and you end up getting it to more viable cases. It happened with solar, it happened with wind, where you had, getting to 1 megawatt turbine was a huge deal. Today, you've got single turbines that are coming up with 8, 9, 10, sometimes even 13 megawatts. So economies of scale are there. It comes with time. And that's something that then makes the case for, kind of leads into your question, should we aggregate? Right? So there are several questions there. Where are these buses being manufactured, and is aggregation a good idea? Right? So where are the buses being manufactured? I think the technology is further ahead in some of the other countries than India at this point. Part of it deals with the whole electric vehicle issue, where countries are certainly ahead. China's probably got the lead on that in terms of large buses, but Europe is certainly up there. Daimler-Benz is doing a lot of work on that. Volvo is doing a lot of work on that, and there are others who are doing work. While in general, I think in the private sector, we tend to believe that competition is good. I think in cases of technologies like this, where economies of scale are important, aggregation is probably an excellent idea. Not only does it help you with purchasing, because you got a single source purchaser, but I think it also helps you with giving manufacturers a critical mass on which to base their production, on which to plan their business models. I think that's very important. It's very important. Question is, are we going to go to a sole source manufacturer for that? That's number one. How is the financing going to come? If this is a central government, let's take India, if this is a central government authority that is going to do the aggregation, that is going to be the purchaser, you are probably less likely to get the private sector arms of multilaterals coming in. Unless you structure the financing in what I call a cake model or a tiered model. You have subsidies, you have incentives, you have concessional financing forming the base that gets the project to a certain level. And then you have certain aspects that can be commercialized, and therefore you bring in commercial financiers for specific aspects. It can be done. It is difficult. It is complicated. It can be done. However, you've got to use public money, public funds where it's needed the most right in the beginning at the base. And you have to have a mechanism to really push this towards commercialization, push this towards a return. The reason is there are plenty of risks, and it's my perception, this is purely my perception, that the private sector is far better at pricing risks. They're price risks. It's the risks that really focus that, if the private sector sees a risk, very rarely does it say, this is something I'm not touching. It basically says, if this happens, I'm going to have to put so much money more, or my return is going to be affected in such a way, so I need an additional compensation. The private sector is far better at pricing risks and far better at managing risks, which is why I believe that having the private sector involved and having a private angle to financing to the entire operation is very important. Madhav, I may have skipped a few things that you raised. Do you have specific points?
I think thank you, Ram. That was excellent, and we'll probably come back to you if there's more time at the end. But I think you've raised very, very relevant points, and I think so. Next, I will, since you spoke last about aggregation, I will go to Polash, and Polash. One is you want to respond to what has been spoken about before this. Polash is the head of electric mobility at CSL. But also, I think one of the issues that you've been talking about is this whole concern of the dearth of operators, in India, so, how are you thinking also about sort of distributing risks between operators, STUs and OEM? So just, yeah, your thoughts on that.
Thank you, Madhav, and thank you for inviting me for this panel. So, my views or personal view is that it is, deployment of electric buses is a financial problem, right? So, Mr. Sen talked about delta. So there is a delta. So I will share two views. One would be the short-term view, another would be the long-term view. In short term, state pitching in for VGF, the central subsidy coming into the picture, the aggregation model will reduce the GCC prices. So there essentially we are trying to mitigate that that delta, right? So getting hold of concessional money, international money, right? Any other funds like air quality fund that an STU can claim from the state. So all these things will essentially reduce this delta, but that will be for a short duration or a short-term plan. So right now with this grand challenge, in fact, we are sitting with a happy problem with money which is equivalent to 4,000 odd buses. I'm getting an over subscription of around 10,000 buses. So that's an happy problem, but it's a short-term view for the solution that we are looking at. So the long-term view would be, it was an eye-opener when we spoke to few of the bus operator who are right now in the conventional IC bus deployment business. There are people who are running fleets of 5,000 to 8,000 buses for the last 30 years. So it was very interesting to know that why these people are not coming forward to manage and operate an electric bus, right? So over here, there are a few things that will play an important role. Is the role of domestic institution, financial institution. Why a normal bank, an operator is looking, towards funding from a domestic institution, a bank. Why the bank is not extending the kind of loans that this particular operator is looking at. The second would be on the resale value of the bus itself, right? So there is no resale market. A traditional bank looks at it looks like an auto product, right? So an automobile loan. So if there is no existing resale value of this vehicle, that will be an issue. If there are questions on the performance of the vehicle, on the battery system, so these kind of issues are holding back the domestic financial institute to come on board and finance the traditional operators. So we are trying to mitigate few of these questions, right? There is a lot of hand-holding that is required for the operator to come into the picture. A lot of awareness is required in terms of the technology and the kind of business model that we are rolling out for this particular technology segment. So it will take some time to get out of this financial problem, but the initial the short-term view would be to launch this grand challenge and aggregate as much of demand that is possible and bring down the cost of operation to a lower level, so that it is beneficial for the already cash-strapped STUs to come on board and venture into this electric deployment business. So that's my thoughts. Over to you, Madhav.
Thank you very much, Polash, for that. And now I'll call upon Jürgen Baumann. Jürgen is the project head in GIZ India. Jürgen, I mean, how do you position the TUMI e-bus mission at the central and state level to support the scale of e-buses in India? So what is your thinking around that and supporting this whole sort of scaling up agenda?
First of all, thank you for inviting me, and I apologize for some technical problems. GIZ is meanwhile very strict in the usage of Zoom, so I will not switch on the camera because it's not possible to hear from me. And I'm not prepared to talk about the TUMI e-bus mission, because this is the responsibility of a different kind of project. TUMI e-bus mission is a global project And we as a bilateral project are supporting the colleagues and WRI, of course, and the other members of the coalition in the action on the ground. What I would like to do is I would like to give some of my thoughts about the topic. To start, I would like to point out that I haven't seen really many innovative funding options for infrastructure development in the last decades. Most of these so-called innovative options are basically loans or grants in a different form. You can look at green bonds. This is a special form of a loan. Honestly, no investor is financing anything without expecting to get repaid. And we have heard this just minutes before. Or he is willing to give you a present, somehow not so often happening in this form. My second remark for the beginning would be that talking about e-buses only would give a false impression of what is necessary to be done overall. We all should agree that we are talking about a major change of two ecosystems. One that is going to be shut down, and this is the ICE system with petrol and everything around it, and one that must be developed. Both systems have many different stakeholders and shareholders. So there are many friends and many powerful enemies in this game. Be careful whom you are going to trust. Of course, there are good reasons to move forward, transitioning the Indian bus fleets from diesel buses to zero emission buses. To be clear, zero emission at tailpipe is what we might expect for the next decade. The competition in renewable energies will lead to ongoing electricity production in coal power plants for the next 20 years almost. Nevertheless, emissions from ICE-powered motor vehicles are responsible for about 2/3 of air pollution in urban areas. Since buses operated by public transport utilities contribute a significant share of diesel consumption in urban areas, all STUs must plan to transform their fleets to zero-emission fleets over the next decade or so, and thereby reduce costs of operations, as well as contribute towards reduction of emissions, noise pollution, and resultant health problems. What does that mean for the topic that should be discussed here? First, all decision makers today would need a sound understanding of the long-lasting impact of any decision they are coming to. And the decision makers should have a sound strategy how to handle this transition process, in their case, for the next decade at least. Second, as we are talking about money, I'm recommending thinking about an instrument called business plan. Such a plan would help to understand the different puzzle pieces and their special relevance in this completely new ecosystem. It also helps to understand funding opportunities and who could contribute to different parts of this new system. We have lined out a little bit how it is done in Chile, and there are some good ideas how this could be done. The old way of buying a bus was approaching an OEM and asking him for the price of his product. For sure, tendering took place to show transparency. Either a bank or the state would provide the necessary budget, and the STU became owner of the bus. Due to the time, I do not want to talk about all the different ways like lease models and so on at this point. Simplified spoken, a bus was a bus. When I first started to talk to BMTC some years ago about the topic of transitioning their bus fleet, I asked them how they would solve the problem to pull out a 5 tons battery bus that is empty from a bus stuck in a traffic jam in the center of the city. You cannot recharge such a vehicle right on the street, can you? A diesel bus would just get refilled because you might even bring diesel with a bicycle that allows to move the bus to the next depot. This example might help to understand that besides the decision about the technology you want to use in detail, you need also to plan the routes and depots. Routes are connected to revenues, depots are connected to real estate and investment. Charging means electricity. Zero emission is asking for renewable energy. And at the end, we are talking for STUs like BMTC that mobility should be a service to the customer. Even in the best case, I haven't found so far any public or private entity that would be able to invest into the rolling stock and run the operations on the ticket box revenues. That is fine with me. Mobility is part of the basic human rights in my personal understanding. Sustainable development goals like leave no one behind help us to understand that the society has the responsibility to provide citizens with decent solutions. Must not always be the first-class coach, but must be a service that allows to move people or goods in an affordable and qualitative good manner from A to B. The politicians thus need to get reasonable figures for the budgets because they decide how much of the costs would have to be spent via fares and how much via direct subsidies. To give them these figures, the price for the different puzzle pieces has to be calculated. And of course, we have opportunities to mix these prices in a different way compared to the past. For example, I'm talking about leaving battery and charging infrastructure with a power utility. As a mobility service provider, an STU has no long-standing interest in a battery. The power utility should have, because even after the planned first life, the battery could be used for energy storage. Looking, for example, at a trolley bus that seemed to be the most viable e-bus so far, you might also use these vehicles during off-peak times to transport goods. The city of Berlin, for example, has evaluated if their subway system or the tram lines would be feasible for delivering freight to inner city malls and shops during night times. So a bus nowadays might be a different means of transport compared to the past. By the way, the price for bus users in Germany are not differentiated between the category of bus that you have. If it's an e-bus or diesel bus, if it's a diesel 6 or diesel 4 bus, the price is not in no city differentiated due to the kind of bus you are running.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. We have.
Let me close up for a minute. A good example for a business plan has been developed from BMTC with the support of our colleagues from C40 CFF. Some of them have also been contributing to this fantastic WRI event in recent years. I would recommend for everyone to have a look at the C40 CFF homepage, and you can find more important documents and business plan as a idea how we can do it. So this would be a way where you can really see the complete picture that will help to transition the bus fleet over the next 10 years. From the German side, we will support the Indian development process also in the next years. There is a Green Urban Mobility Partnership, which is agreed between the government of India and government of Germany. So we will stay on board, not only with the Tumi bus mission, but also with follow-on technical cooperation projects until 2030. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. Thank you very much. You've made very pertinent points to the discussion. Also, I think, the Bangalore, like we will hear a little bit about what's happening in Maharashtra and Tamil Nadu, but I think the case study from Bangalore and BMTC that you've pointed out is also an interesting, data point for the conversation. So next, I'll come to Nishant. Nishant, I mean, I think, any from your side as a private sector, as one of the people supplying the buses, how are you seeing sort of this sort of movement to electric buses, and especially moving to the other point I do want to bring up, when Aparna presented the average age of the bus, and it's not just restricted to electric, and the average age of fleet was 12 years. But we have seen great examples in Latin America where 17-year-old buses and 20-year-old buses are running because they meet all of the performance criteria that is there, and that is really where you start making money. And I think in India, on this whole total cost of ownership, I mean, we have really, whether it's private vehicles, whether it's buses, we sort of have got stuck in this process of lower cost vehicles, lower life cycles. And I think, I don't know if you want to comment on that, and, do you see this transition to electrification also as an opportunity to change that conversation, because it's very clear. I mean, the real money is to be made once you've sort of moved in beyond 10 or 12 years of the life of bus, and if you've done a good job on operations and maintenance, the quality of roads that you're supplied are good, then you should really be able to run the bus for longer. So I guess that's from your perspective as a manufacturer, just any thought on that, and also any other sort of broad thoughts on the conversation that have happened so far. Just 1 minute, let me introduce you since we have an audience also. Just to let you know, Nishant Arya is the vice chairman of the JBM group. Yeah. Over to you, Nishant.
Yeah, thanks, Madhav. Pleasure to be here. I think we've had a great discussion today where from different thought leaders, from the government, from financial institutions, as well as we've heard a lot of points which can really develop the whole sector in a very institutionalized manner and build the whole industry in a very strategic and a very structured way, which is very important. I think what is critical here is that how we do not look at the bus independently, because it's the whole EV ecosystem which needs to be deployed and looked at. Because if we look at people seeing in certain cases that whether we have single charge battery pack, or we have vehicles where they are running for opportunity charging, the whole configuration of the technology and the vehicle has to be allowed to get deployed in a manner where we are not carrying battery packs, we are carrying passengers. That's the basic motto of buses, which is there today. And that is why you'd see India has benchmark in all the Euro norms, the BS6 norms from 1 through 6 from Europe. And if we see all the European buses which are deployed, are majority in this area where they have opportunity charging so that they can reduce the weight of the vehicle, they can reduce the battery weight, and they can have technologies which can sustain. And you mentioned about the vehicle life. The vehicle life also becomes much longer with this, with the battery weight going down, and that allows you to reduce the high voltage aggregate cost also, because with the weight of the vehicle going up, the aggregate cost also gets added up. Another important element here is that I always compare electric to solar, and we heard that from many other colleagues also here today, clearly mentioning that. And when we look at solar, so solar industry, we put up solar plants. So then the solar technology in a solar plant which is put up is for 25 years. We don't change that midway there. And then whenever you are having new set of plants, so the new set of technologies for that particular point in time do come in. So one can't see that as electric bus today, which is there, after 5 years, I will reduce the cost, because the whole vehicle architecture is developed and designed in a particular way for it to adapt. Definitely certain technological changes with respect to battery can be adopted, but it can't be a sea change that completely you are changing the vehicle. That's not possible. Then we talk about asset utilization. I think asset utilization is the key. How can we sweat the asset with higher number of kilometers in a day? Routes which are good routes are provided to electric vehicles where there's higher density, and those routes have a very clear requirement in that city, because for any CNG or diesel vehicles, they have multiple options to be there. So route planning is a very critical element which should not be missed out here. And those routes should not be such, otherwise most of the STUs are used to seeing that today it's on route 1, tomorrow it can go on route 2, then it goes on route 3, because the infrastructure related to that route is also planned accordingly. Whether we talk about opportunity charging, we talk about depot charging, we talk about overnight charging or intermittent charging during the day. At the same time, it's also essential to see that the drivers need to have very strong and very good training. So training of drivers, the way they drive a normal bus vis-a-vis electric bus is very different. Then clearly when we look at, we have clear PMP requirements in India where we localize these products and other things. So we need to see that how are we focusing and really taking up Atmanirbhar Bharat in a big way in India. I think that's my view, that we are promoting Make in India, and we are seeing that how companies are localizing and having an integrated ecosystem and value chain. So we see that it should also be linked to the right energy sources which are being used. So how renewable energy can be linked? Like you have seen, Madhav, that today Delhi Metro has started purchasing solar power from Reva. Now Indian Railway is also doing something similar. How we can have cheaper power which can be available, which is a fuel for this, and such kind of tie-ups can be done, so that we are having end-to-end green, which reduces the power cost as well. And simultaneously, we also have to understand that each technology, whether we talk about in battery technology or aggregate technology, defines the whole vehicle structure. So every company would be doing that in their own way. Why I would say that the life of 10 years, I think life of 10 to 12 years is a good life, but we should not be looking at a longer life. Because in many countries, 8 years is what the ideal life is. In certain cases, it goes up to 15, 17 years. You mentioned South America and other places where it is prevalent. But 10 years to 12 years is the right lifespan, because as a technology changes, you do not want to have a vehicle where you had an opportunity not to use it for very long, but at the same time have a higher asset utilization during that period and that life. I think that is what would be a defining moment for this sector. Then when you are looking at charging technology and skill development, I think that is a very important element here, because the kind of skills which are available for this sector for it to grow are going to be very critical. When we also look at the kind of downtime which is there with the power infra which comes into play, times the quality of power which is available, I think that is very critical in seeing that the battery life gets determined from power infra also, and from charging also, and the way the vehicle is driven. So all these three elements need to be seen. So we need to really go into those details there. On the other hand, when we look at the vehicle technology which is changing, we are seeing that software plays a very important role. How different companies, insurance companies, banks can see that the vehicle health monitoring system is being put in place, and they have real-time data how the vehicle is performing. It is not just that you have bought some vehicles and put them into the field. So, and another thing which is critical here is that we should be following very strong safety standards. So like in Europe and many other countries, we see in Japan, CCS2, CHAdeMO technologies which are there. I think that's the globally accepted standard. So it's very important that we bring in some such standards where these standards are driving the whole industry very clearly. Because I feel that safety and technology first, followed by the best TCO, is the right methodology to look at this sector. And enough has been spoken about financing, low-cost funds, and how those funds can be available. Like in today's day and age, when we look at this sector, earlier on, we used to see that buses used to be funded for a period of 5 years. Then when we entered the bus segment in last 5 years, so we try to see that different stakeholders took it to about 7 years funding, and they were able to see that even if they had high-end buses or premium buses, they could afford them, and they had a competitive cost per kilometer. Here, I feel that again, for the longer term, we should see that long-term funding, 7 years to 10 years funding should be there for such kind of contracts. How the contracts are secure in terms of payment terms and the escrow agreements which are put in place, so that the financial institutions get that kind of comfort when they are funding such kind of projects. Because how the VGF will be provided, I think those things will play a very critical role. And to a large extent, as we have discussed and we have seen in the CSL documents also, if the specifications and structures can be simplified and can be standardized to a large extent, I think that will bring in a huge economies of scale. And that is what is required. And I really appreciated one thing which Ashish ji mentioned, which he is looking to do in Delhi, that in a span of next 5 years, how they are putting out their roadmap. So every state or city where you are participating, you should be asking them that they should give a roadmap for next 5 years, 4 years, 3 years, whatever we are talking about here. As that gives a very good clarity of the kind of demand we are talking about, the aggregation which is there in place, and what the manufacturers could look at. Because I think somebody clearly mentioned, because that is what would be driving the costs down as we are able to aggregate that demand and people clearly see and how things are moving forward. Another point which is very critical here is that in the supply chain, everything is covered more or less, but how we are seeing that semiconductor and power electronics manufacturing becomes a key element in India, because that is a huge consumption pattern which we are seeing with electric vehicles, which will be going up significantly. Otherwise, our dependence would become quite large on many international players, and we would not be able to do that. Not to say that we are not looking to work with international players as Indian companies and companies in India, but how that can be available locally and they can co-work with companies in India to do so.
Thanks, Nishant. Thanks a lot for raising. There are two things that actually you also raised. I mean, not probably relevant for this financing conversation, but it was also a part of the conversation we had before, and that's one. I mean, we always talk about electric buses from the perspective of impacting air pollution, and so ideally you would want to actually run them when there is more stop and go traffic, because that's where the exposure to criteria pollutants etc. is high. But the operators of course want routes that are profitable. So how do you maybe bring, if we operate them on these sort of routes that are actually good from an air pollution perspective, how do we sort of cross subsidize that or provide additional subsidy on those, will be something to thought about. But so that's sort of one point. The other thing was also, as we design buses and peak hour loads are always the highest, a lot of times you want to only use the buses in the peak hours, right? And again, you made the whole point about maximizing asset utilization. But as Jürgen spoke about, even thinking about using them for movement of freight, etc., at night hours and these, right? So I think some of these ideas will have to be brought together. I think as we think about sort of electric buses for public operations in cities. I mean, what we have seen also with PPPs in India in the past is the buses end up on profitable routes, and on the non-profitable routes, then you have these mini buses or Tata Magics running. And that is also an outcome we don't want on our city. So I think figuring out again the financing and the cross subsidizing across routes, etc., also becomes an important point that we have to keep in mind. Swati, I'll come to you next. You've been fairly active, in conversations for funding 500 electric buses in 3 cities of Tamil Nadu. So, how does KFW view risks when offering low interest loans to STUs? And, how do you leverage funds from the international markets? What are the products offered by KFW in India? Just for all of you, Ms. Swati Khanna is the senior sector specialist at KFW. So over to you, Swati.
Thank you, Madhav. Thank you for having KFW here at Connect KARO. And it was actually enlightening to hear views from different stakeholders, right, from an OEM to aggregators like CESL. So I think I'll take away quite a few food for thought away from here. Coming to KFW, of course, KFW is a sister, concern under the Indo-German Development Cooperation together with GIZ. So KFW looks after the financial cooperation part of the Indo-German Development Cooperation, and KFW Development Bank is a part of the KFW Banking Group, which is a state-owned bank in Germany, and it's a AAA rated bank. So access to finance is pretty good, I would say. In India, urban mobility being one of the focal areas, we do sovereign financing only as a mandate with Government of India. However, so the direct agreements and financing is available to Government of India, and then it can online further to states and STUs or central and public sector undertakings accordingly, depending upon how the project is structured. Coming to what KFW offers in India, KFW's primary products are concessional loans or reduced interest loans over a considerably long period. For metros, it's of course much higher, but or for high capex projects. But for buses, it's since we are doing currently one bus project in India, so there are not too many examples. But currently, we could be looking at anything between 10 to 15 years, depending upon the project. Another product that we have is called ODA Plus loan, which is slightly expensive than the reduced interest loan, but the details, of course, are available on our website as well. So the subsidized concessional loans or the reduced interest loans are primarily because the German Ministry of Development and Economic Cooperation provides subsidies for projects which have higher climate impact and social impact as well. On how we can pass on these financial instruments to various agencies in India, So our primary product is investment financing, which looks at capex or outright purchase model, as we have discussed in buses, which is also being taken forward by government of Tamil Nadu. So government, since we are talking about the Tamil Nadu project, so Tamil Nadu project is the bus modernization project for all cities in the state of Tamil Nadu, which will look at replacement of the existing fleet, partly with diesel BS6 buses, but also a transition towards electric mobility, wherein you mentioned about 500 electric buses. So the overall program that the state has developed is approximately 900 million euros. And that's the whole roadmap, as Nishant was also mentioning a while ago. And this is only the first phase, which has 500 electric buses and roughly 2,000 BS6 buses to be replaced. So herein, we are also looking at the overall ecosystem of bus sector, as well as regards e-bus ecosystem as well. So right from the fleet to charging infrastructure, to depot modernization, to bringing in onboard analytics, ERP, digitalization, etc., so that we don't do piecemeal efforts and then there is a lag in the future. So the whole program roadmap for next 15 years is prepared, and we are doing it in phases because, as some of the guests here also mentioned, that it's an evolving technology, and probably somewhere everybody doesn't have a full trust in what today is the final product. So the state is also looking at a transition over a period of time, but I think they have got a pretty strong roadmap in that sense. And of course, Gerald can also complement later on, because World Bank is also working under the city partnership and other projects in Tamil Nadu. So that is on the Tamil Nadu bus project. It's a concessional loan again, a pretty concessional loan. Of course, I cannot disclose further details over here, but the state is pretty happy to take it up. And we are working also with them through grants on how they can further elaborate and have a more robust business model, as well as monetization of its land assets at depots and otherwise. So we are looking at reforms as well, together with investment financing under the project. The project is contributed with 200 million euros currently from the Development Corporation. Apart from investment financing, there are a couple of other options or lines that KFW could explore in India. I'll quickly run through them. One of them is the public sector banks, through whom we could have credit lines to support OEMs or operators or fleet operators per se, because these are the sections wherein, because of the credit worthiness, the access to finance is very limited. So here is where the German cooperation could again come in. We have had certain discussions, but as one of the panelists said, that the banks are not really sure on if they should go in for it. And for that, I think there's also a requirement that all the stakeholders get into a discussion with these banks as well, and build up on the confidence that this is a technology which is here to stay and it will only grow forward rather than reach a stagnation stage. So the credit lines with public sector banks is another option. Then, of course, looking at leasing platforms and institutional partners, for example, CESL and others, who could aggregate the demand, forward it, or introduce a leasing platform so that they can also save on the capital costs and also streamline the operations. But of course, availability of operators is something that we are a little concerned about here. The other option could also be unbundling or delinking, as Aparna mentioned in her presentation, which was adopted in Chile. And although one of our sister concerns, KFW Apex, was involved there for diesel buses under the mobility owner concept, wherein also the delinking of the services and the assets was done, and it worked out pretty well, and it has worked out much better on the electric mobility aspect. So these are some of the critical points that, or products that we could offer in India across the sectors. And the investment financing, particularly for the STUs, because of course, most of them are cash strapped. So with the support from Government of India and the state government, this could be looked into. Just to quickly respond to the ticketing of the electric buses and the diesel buses for the passengers, as a development bank, we do feel that it should be a par, because we are not introducing a premium service, right? It's a transition. We are wanting to make a transition from fossil fuels to electric. So why to differentiate between the prices? Cross subsidy could be used for other purposes as well. However, as Jürgen also mentioned, that green grid is of critical concern as well. So apart from the investments in mobility sector, we are trying to push and work with states and central government also on the renewable energy sector, so that we can walk off from the coal-based electric inputs. Thanks, Madhav. I think that's all from my end.
Thanks, Swati. Gerald, please just, I think, if you can actually, I know you've been actively sort of working with Tamil Nadu, Maharashtra also. So, I mean, if you could just share, what your experience has been, and, and
sure.
Really building from the conversation so far, if you can add.
Sure. Thank you, Madhav, and thanks for WRI for inviting the bank, the World Bank, to participate. First, what I find fascinating is, for anybody who has attended Connect KARO for many years, the shift in the conversation is very noticeable. Like 3 years ago, people were vaguely considering that as an idea. I mean, e-buses as an idea worth pursuing. And now it's really moving to scale. We are starting to speak about large-scale solution, and that's quite important. The first thing I would like to say is, it needs to go beyond the delta, actually, from our perspective, in the sense that the bus system in itself needs a bit of nurturing to come to the point where bankability can be ensured. When you look at a typical urban bus service, it loses money, right? So it loses money as a regular diesel, old diesel bus. And then as you move to an EV one, then it loses even more money. And frankly, from a private operator coming into a system, what they will want to make sure is that the full cost is being covered. So it's more than just a delta. It's ensuring that as part of the thinking of how to roll out those services, there is a comprehensive look at the total cost associated with the variability gap funding, the difference between the cost of operating and the revenue collected. So the way the World Bank is engaging with state right now is to discuss about what is their vision for urban mobility or electric mobility comprehensively as a state, and how do they want to strengthen the institutions to be able to manage those large new contractual agreements that are being discussed, those new technologies, thinking about how to deal with an efficient procurement of services. And here I'm emphasizing services, not buses, right? I mean, the point is to provide a bus service. It's not to provide X number of buses. Nobody cares about a bus. People care about a service that provides them accessibility. So it's actually very different from a solar panel, if I may say, which once you have built it, it sits on the rooftop and it will produce its electricity. Here you're dealing with a lot of people, a lot of challenge, and a 10-year time frame of implementation. The next thing I wanted to say is, as you look at the kind of schemes that CSL is pursuing, you're looking at 3,500 buses over 10 years. That's 17,000 crore, right? That number is actually pretty massive, and it's going to require a lot of tweaking from a financing point of view to reach a point where the banks that are going to have to come behind those kind of scheme on the private sector side are going to be feeling comfortable, in particular post-COVID, where a lot of the contracts that were entered into were not necessarily honored. So we look at this as a World Bank group, actually, bringing both the IFC part that was mentioned earlier together with the World Bank, and look at how do you improve the process of contracting, the contracting quality, the dispute resolution mechanism that are put in place, the guarantee mechanism that can be added, so that participants in that market are going to feel confident that when they come into one of these big contracts, they are going to be paid for in the long term with mechanism that give them comfort. And that's quite relevant as you think about both the large-scale program that CSL is developing, but also more broadly the 150,000 urban bus deficit that exists in India, right? Because the idea is to look at those programs like CSL and think about how do they prepare for the transition to e-buses at scale. Now, to work this out requires looking at the master concession agreement that has been ruling the game. We know from having analyzed 50% of a transaction in FAME 1 and 2 up to now, that there are ways of improving those concession documents in ways that could reduce the cost of contracting those services by about 10%. We also see the opportunity of creating economies of scale by clubbing demand for like type of procurement, and that's what CSL is doing, in ways that foster sufficient quantities for the market to get excited. And the market includes both the Indian market that is nascent and the global market moving forward. That can reduce the cost a further 5-10%. We also look at the way to consider the different profile of participants in the market. The OEM on one side that are interested in providing a bus, the operator on the other side that are interested in operating the buses, and the financiers that may be interested in either of the two models, but not necessarily in both combined. So that's where the type of model that was established in Latin America, which was covered this week, become quite important in terms of thinking about unbundling, leasing, creating, scales economies, but scale economies that, channel the risk in very predictable manner for the financiers. Altogether, those elements are quite essential to actually reduce the cost. So if you think about a typical FAME 2 cost of a vehicle kilometer of 75 rupees, with a conductor cost about 15 rupees, you can reduce by about 10% that cost through an improvement in the MCA. You can further reduce it by about 10 rupees through effective unbundling, and that squeezes the need for variability gap funding. Okay, that's quite critical for the market then to be able to sense that yes, there will be a payment associated with a service over the tenure of this commitment, right? We are speaking about the long-term commitment. The next thing that is quite important is for the participants in those markets, the need to have a notion that they are going to be paid, which can be addressed through a World Bank guarantee of payment linked to a counter guarantee by the state, or a first loss facility that can be provided through also a facility that could be set up by a public bank and open to participants in this kind of market with proper contractual term, proper funding, and the like. Now, when you combine all of these elements, you start from this overall VGF of 30 rupees per kilometer, if you consider a revenue of 60. You improve revenues through better advertising, better targeting of where the buses are being used, etc. You squeeze through those mechanisms, and that squeezes essentially the VGF very substantially, by as much as 70%. Now, that's part of the big story of financing, right? It's about squeezing that cost so that it becomes much more bankable. And as you do that, the 30% capex that comes from purchasing the buses becomes something that is much more manageable to finance. And the cost of financing reducing on 30% becomes very material in making the full story viable. So what do we do as World Bank on that? So we work with cities in two different ways, thinking about how to create public transport service contract, which contractualize the relationship between the state and the STU and the associated variability gap funding that come with that. Or we support the transition towards gross cost contract with a quality requirement in ways that fulfill the type of features that I just described. And that combined, makes it much more viable to start with. We can, as bank, also support part of the viability gap funding associated with that, which, if you have squeezed the cost and provide part of a VGF, this is what is being developed for Chennai, allows essentially a matching of resources with other resources from state or national level. So, I mean, I know we are a bit short of time, so I'm coming to a conclusion on that, but there is a lot of financial engineering that is required simply because you're prepaying essentially your fuel cost by buying a battery. And that requires a lot of work on contracts, financial mechanism, and the like. We are not really into financing buses per se, but really unlocking the system that allows the service delivery to be more sustainable.
Thanks.
So that's, yeah.
Thanks. And, I think if we, one last actually a response to a question, and Gerald, I thought you would be sort of, in a good position to maybe answer that. It's just, how, given that in India, STUs run, mostly buses are run by STUs, which are governed by the Road Transport Corporation Act of 1950. I mean, what opportunities do you see this transition of e-buses doing to also sort of, really reimagining, that act, or, I mean, I think there's a question from the audience. So I just thought if you can just quickly, in short, just try to respond to it. So.
Okay, so I think it would not be necessarily only linked to e-buses, but it's rather linked to the MOVA program, which may provide a lot of opportunities to have different models coming through, right? Because of this variety of cities that MOVA is going to deal with, the diversity of profile will be bigger, and that should offer more opportunities for alternative solutions. Now, we look at, an overseeing by a government body of bus service delivery as a positive thing, right? Because it allows integrated planning with the metros, with the rest of the system, and that makes sense. But a disengagement from operational aspect is also something that works better because it allows the public sector to focus on service delivery by others, as opposed to delivering the service themselves, which once you are delivering, 2-3 million trips a day, you don't have, necessarily the bandwidth to step back and see, am I delivering actually on my broader mandate as a government agency? So that transition, I think, is very much open. There will be a very big role to play by the private sector coming in and delivering those services. And, as the audience says, also an opportunity for the STUs to maybe step back and be more the organizer of services with a focus on the quality of service delivery than running all the buses. And it can be a balance of the two.
Thanks a lot. And for those who, in addition to this, what we are discussing, this top 10 cities, anywhere between 4,000 to 10,000 electric buses and the support from there is also Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs is soon going to put out a program, which is about 18,000 crores. It was announced by the finance minister in last year's budget. And that's going to be for other cities, not the top 10 cities, to allow. So, we'll see probably an addition of, almost a 20 to 25,000 new buses across Indian cities. And I think this becomes the opportunity that Gerald was talking with. Unfortunately, we don't really have a time for a discussion. I mean, this is always what happens when you have so many sort of speakers bringing such diverse perspectives. I think, so I will now invite my colleague, Pawan Mulkutla, who's the director for our electric mobility program at WRI. Is the director for the clean technology and electric mobility program. So Pawan, over to you to close out the conversation. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Madhav, and all the panelists. I think the last 2 hours, and in fact, the whole day, we have been talking about electric buses, the route choices in the earlier session, and now the procurement, the funding and financing. And I think we've got a diverse set of views. And it's also interesting to see that, how this is going to unfold the journey of electric buses in India with, of course, CSL now talking about demand aggregation, and Niti Aayog insisting the focus on 9 cities in India where electric buses would be deployed. And it was very clear, while the options may be limited in terms of the sources and the instruments itself, but I think there's a lot of room and space in India itself to really see how do we really start looking at mitigating various risks and also addressing the challenges that are associated with the financing, and also looking at this whole procurement process and funding of electric buses. So I wanted to take this opportunity. What we would also do is that kind of summarize the proceedings from this discussion and circulate with our panelists, and kind of create a note that we could then share with CESL and also with Niti Aayog as a short-term measure what's happening. I think, Polash, at the beginning we were talking about what's being done today and what would be needed in the long term when we're talking about scaling up of electric buses. And I think this requires further discussion and a more focused group conversations to really see how do we really leverage, and also maybe bring in experts like Ram, Vivek, and of course Gerald, you are here, and others as well, to really think through this a little bit more ahead. And with that, would really take this opportunity. Thank you, Polash, Gerald, Vivek, Ram, Vishant, Swati, and Randhir, and Sudhendu ji, and everyone who has really contributed to this conversation, Ashish ji. And for really, it's a very diverse set, really listening from the operators, from OEM, from experts. And I think there's a long way to go, and we are on the right track. Thank you, everyone.
I just also wanted to mention we have a closing session where Mr. Suresh Prabhu will deliver an address. So if you're interested, at 4:30, we'll have a conversation with Mr. Suresh Prabhu. So please join if you have the time. Thank you.